Hey, DM here with another review from the DM's Guild. This time we're looking at Vampirism-and-Lycanthropy Curses of the Blood by E.R.F. Jordan for $2.99 on the DM's Guild. That is a really difficult title to say. What is this? If you've ever played a Curse of Strahd game, or if you've ever played a very vampire heavy like Ravenloft or something of that nature where you're in werewolves and vampire territory constantly, somebody invariably gets bitten by either a vampire, werewolf, or some other virulent carrying disease. And these are rules that allow players to continue playing with those characters and maybe even just carry on as maybe new a vampire or a werewolf or werebear, were-tiger, were-boar, were-rat, were-hare, whatever, were-everywhere. But these are rules specific for those. So if you're playing in those kinds of games, either Curse of Strahd, Ravenloft, or some other vampire or lycanthrope heavy game, this is a supplement that you'll really want to pick up. It's split into two sections, Vampirism and Lycanthropy. So if you don't know, Lycanthropy means all the were creatures. Each of the sections details the characteristics of that character or NPC, which you could use them on, once they contract the disease, including any weaknesses they might have. In the case of vampires, you have the classic things like garlic, running water, crosses, well not crosses, but any holy symbol really, holy water, stakes, sunlight, or lycanthropes, silver. You can then move on to the methods of infection though, and these are quite varied and give the DM a lot of leeway in terms of how you might implement them. There's the classic stuff, like in the case of vampires, when they bite somebody, reduce their HP to 0, 1d4 days later, that character rises as a vampire. Or in the case of lycanthropes, a single bite from them can allow you to contract the disease depending on your constitution saving throw. Or you can take the more flavorful approach to make pacts with dark gods or powers, or contracts with various devils and things of that nature to either become a vampire or any of the were creatures. We then come to the template itself, and this is what you apply to whatever poor creature has contracted this either vampirism or lycanthropy. That does include both the strengths and weaknesses. Now the two diverge here a bit, with the vampire taking on some of the characteristics of the base class, such as things like the humans lacking the vampire's normal sunlight sensitivity, or if the character happens to be a Kenku, they might gain limited flight in their future. The lycanthropes instead present various kinds of lycanthropes, various kinds of were creatures. You've got your werebear, your were-boar, your were-rat, your were-tiger, and were-hare. I'm kidding about that last one. And obviously you have your classic werewolf. There is a general guidance here about how to go about controlling the bestial forms, but nothing too specific, and that is left to the DM. Now, what did I like about this? I like the attempt at making the vampires different depending on their subclass or subrace, and for using a fairly good lore reason for doing so. It's kind of like, well, all those stories you hear about vampires, about them having the ability to charm and fly and turn to bats and things, they were kind of like, well, everyone lumped all the vampires together, when in reality it was only a couple of different vampires that could do very specific things. I like that there are options for other methods of contracting the diseases or these conditions. It means that it makes it possible for players to potentially seek them out. They can actually go to various people to say, I want to be a vampire. I want that immortal lifestyle. I want to be a lycanthrope. I want to have those powers. It means that it's more free-forming. You're not just hunting down werewolves and vampires trying to get them to bite you all the time. The whole plug specifically for the lycanthropes controlling their bestial forms is a good one. I like that it steadily gets easier and easier to manage, and it feels natural. If you don't know what the whole is, in the lycanthrope setting, in the lycanthrope contracting diseases section for the normal monster manual one, when you contract lycanthropy, you're basically told your alignment shifts to evil, you have no choice in the matter, and bam, you are a lycanthrope, and that character is basically dead. Unless you attempt to control it, and then it's very vague about what control it means. In this case, it gives you DCs and wisdom saving throws that get gradually easier the more full moons you go through. The greater vampire is an interesting idea. It allows players to kind of go and have something to shoot for, albeit several decades down the line once they've been vampires for a long time. But you could have various NPC, maybe even do like a time skip kind of thing where an NPC starts out as a normal vampire and the players let him go for whatever reason and then he returns as a greater vampire. And I also like that the Lycanthrope's whole ethos and writing is interesting. And then of the two is the most plausible to continue play should a player contract the disease. It's less about creatures of evil and darkness and more about creatures about the bestial nature of things and the kind of primal savagery that invokes and entails. What didn't I like about this supplement? Well, firstly, it would have been nice to include some of the reasons why things like mirrors and garlic are so effective against vampires, just as a nice way of like bringing in some more lore. If you didn't know, mirrors used to be constructed of silver, or at least partially so, which is why reflections from vampires would never show up in them, silver being a pure metal. The garlic side of things is a little more interesting, and it has to do with a lot of different conflicting opinions across various spectrums. You have things like the shape of the garlic bulb looks a lot like a heart, and heart is supposed to be in for healing and blood and everything else. You also have the idea that most of the cultures that represent vampires do suggest, with the exception of the Russian ones, do suggest that vampirism is a disease and thus can be prevented by things like garlic, which are very good boosters for antibodies. They didn't know that, but they knew it made them healthy, so that's kind of the idea behind it. But there's some conflicting information. In the vampire section, it does say that you must subsist on blood in order of the other creatures, but neglects to mention what happens if you don't feed on them. Specificity is important in cases like this. Probably, if I was going to suggest something, levels of exhaustion or loss of powers, but either way, it does need to be called out as specifics as to what happens if this doesn't occur. The racial features, though, for the vampires are really interesting. I like them. I like the attempt. But there's some clear winners in terms of balance and power here. Humans, the Gith, and the elves are clearly the winners. They're much more powerful abilities. The humans gain the ability to walk in the sunlight, and the Gith and the elves gain the ability to dominate a person with a DC 15 wisdom saving throw, which is quite high, especially when you're considering the kind of like ability that it is. It basically lets you just like deaden a person for one shot. It's not quite the same as Charm Person, but it's pretty close, and that can basically wipe a combatant out completely. Other thing I would have loved to have seen is ways to reverse these curses and things, so that once a player contracts these things, they can reverse them without use of magic, maybe more esoteric means. Vampirism is specifically called out as something that's very difficult to remove. Things like Raise Dead still work, but you have to still deal with the vampire part of it. It might have been nice to include interesting and unique ways to change that narrative so that you can have a more interesting, like, roleplay driven way of changing somebody from a vampire back to a human, or from changing somebody from a lycanthrope back into a normal human. Either would have been possible and kind of interesting. Magic hand-waving it kind of defeats the purpose. I know Lesser Restoration and most of the Paladin Lay on Hands ability will get rid of it, but it would have been nice to see kind of more interesting methods. I would also mention that the formatting is a little different than the usual Wizards of the Coast style that we're used to in some of the other supplements I've reviewed, but it's not unreadable, so it's not a bad thing, but it's not something I'm used to, so I think that's kind of like something you have to be aware of as a Dungeon Master. Right, on to my final thoughts and ratings. My rating for this is going to be 3.5 stars out of 5, and I'll give you the reasons why in a second. One, I really like the Lycanthrope class. It's really tightened bolts and really made it good. Really shored up that hole that exists in the monster manual where it just basically says, you can drop lycanthropy and now something happens and you can resist the disease somehow. It tightens that hole very nicely, gives you very specific instructions as to what happens during those things. And that's kind of what you need in those instances. You can't always improv everything. You can try, but sometimes it's nice to have those fallbacks to say, oh, this is how this works, just because it makes it a little easier. The other thing I will mention though, the reason I'm knocking some points off is things like the vampire itself isn't very specific. Things like garlic. What happens when you knock into garlic? Does it actually repel you? Does it mechanically repel you? Or is it just for roleplay purposes? It sounds like it's just for roleplay purposes, but be very specific here. If it actually does something, it should say so. The other thing is, it's not specific what happens when you don't drink blood for a number of times. It would have been nice to have the specific needs there. Also, the sub-race or base races aren't very well balanced. Human and elf and Gith have a clear advantage over the rest of them. Not having the ability to walk in the sun is huge, given it's one of the main weaknesses of the vampire that everyone knows and is easily exploitable. The other thing I will mention is there's no art in this at all. In terms of what's inside the supplement, there's no art. There's a nice piece on the cover, which is really, really good, but it would have been nice to use some of the more of the DM's Guild stock art that you can get for free as part of this. Or even, if you really wanted to push the boat out, purchase something somewhere. But without that art there, it just makes the whole thing feel a bit empty. So that's where my rating is, 3.5 stars out of 5. Add some art, do a polish pass, and a balance pass, and I think this is easily a 5-star supplement. Thank you, this has been DM Dongo. Please do remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and use the affiliate codes that you'll see down below. Thank you, peace out.